us just your name and a bit about your background?
Sure. My name's Corinne, and I live in St. Louis. I've lived here since I was about 3, and my family is from Hawaii and is Chinese. And I just graduated from WashU in the spring with degrees in anthropology and education.
Okay, and what do you do for work?
I was working at a school. Now I'm kind of substitute teaching and piecing some things together.
So I understand that you had, a sort of bad experience at the school. You were talking about earlier today. Could you tell me about it
Sure.
again?
Yeah, so I was at a charter school in St. Louis City, and there were many things that concerned me. The first day when I walked in, I had 5 classes, 4 were regular, 1 was honors. My 4 regular classes were vastly black. My 1 honors class was vastly white. So that was kind of the first thing for me. And then a few weeks into the school year, they had an assembly. And the assembly, we had been told as teachers, was for students to hear about building community and to try and prevent some of the fights that were going on from continuing. And instead they brought in a speaker who got on stage, told a story about learning to ride a unicycle, and in the course of that story put on a fake Asian accent, started mocking Asians, played into the stereotype of the little kid who's an Asian prodigy who can do everything by age 3, and playing into the stereotype of the pushy Asian shopkeeper who speaks in a thick accent and only speaks in one-word sentences, trying to command him to buy things and things like that. So after the assembly, I talked to some of the other teachers, and we had students coming up to us saying, so it's not racism if they're talking about Asians, and it's okay to make fun of Asians. And of course, we said no. And so I went to my principal and I responded to an all-school email that was written by another teacher that said that he felt like there had been a bait and switch on the assembly, that it wasn't at all addressing what we had been promised was going to be addressed. And I immediately responded. Within 4 minutes, I got a response back from one of the assistant principals telling me that by sending out my email that said that I felt offended by the content of the assembly and by the kind of Asian stereotypes that it played into. And that assistant principal immediately told me that sending out that email was damaging to school community, and discussing that kind of racism was damaging to school community, and I should have come directly to her instead of discussing it with my colleagues.
And the assistant principal was white?
White female. I was then, that evening, I received an email from the other assistant principal who told me that it wasn't racist because this speaker has been to Asia. And it wasn't racist because it's not, he didn't see any Asian stereotypes. Apparently he was not familiar with the Asian stereotype of a prodigy child or of a pushy shopkeeper, which just kind of flabbergasted me. And again, I was told that I should not have sent out my email, that I shouldn't be discussing this, and that I was damaging the credibility of the youth speaker to discuss with any of my colleagues that I felt that there were significant racist remarks made.
And what age were the kids who were hearing this?
6th through 8th grade, so middle school kids.
How did they react?
I had so many kids. I had one of my students who was always kind of, not getting in trouble, but always a little more talkative and who tended to be labeled as a difficult student, immediately came up to me after the assembly and gave me a hug and said, "Miss Char, I'm so sorry they were so mean to Asians." And so the students were acutely aware of the racism that was presented. And even the overall principal mentioned to the executive principal that he felt like, in his words, things were said that should not have been said. And yet nothing was done. It was never discussed with the students. And we were told not to discuss those issues at school.
And that experience, do you feel like it's an anomaly in terms of your experience living in St. Louis? You talked earlier about you tell me about the divide.
Sure.
Between
I don't think people see Asians or most of the other minorities in St. Louis other than kind of the black and white binary. Certainly, growing up, we were just considered other. or they tried to put us into a black or white category. So I went to Truman Elementary, and it was one of the years where they were collecting information on the student demographics. And they came out saying that at a school of 700 or so kids, that we were, I think, 18% black, 82% white, 0% other. And I could not believe that we could be 0% other, because mathematically speaking, if there's 700 kids, 7 kids should be 1%. And I knew 7 other kids at my school who were other. And yet we were not being recognized at all in that dichotomy. And it was such a binary, and it feels like perpetually in St. Louis, things are so binary that there's not room to be anything but black or white.
What's your experience been with being involved in the activism related to what's happened since the shooting of Michael Brown?
The activism has been diverse at times, but especially within the St. Louis context, it lacks diversity outside of black and white. So when Ferguson October happened and we had groups coming in from Chicago and New York, it was the first time that I saw an Asian American group coming to the protests. Other than that, it feels like most of the other groups, with the exception of possibly some of the Latino groups that have been more involved, are kind of being pushed to the side, and that it doesn't always seem like either the government or the local activists see there as being a place for the non-black, non-white St. Louisans.
And you were involved for a time with the activism, and then after the commission was announced yesterday, what was your reaction to seeing the makeup of the commission? And just
Sure. I wanted to get involved with all of this to begin with because the very idea that you could be shot as an unarmed teenager is terrifying. And I feel like it's terrifying beyond a single race. It's terrifying because that's a violation of human rights. And so I felt like it was my obligation to get involved, and that whether that was an issue directly facing Asians in St. Louis or not, as any sort of minority, I felt like it was my obligation to stand up where there was oppression. And I never questioned that I wouldn't be kind of welcomed into the activist community, because I felt like we were all fighting for the same thing. We were all going to the protests and training in de-escalation and trying to find ways to get justice for Mike Brown and to heal our city. And when Jay Nixon released the names on the commission, I wasn't entirely shocked that he didn't put on anyone who was not black and not white. I was disappointed, certainly, but it seems to be a trend in government here. So I immediately kind of took to Twitter and took to writing an editorial and things like that, and to trying to draw attention to the fact that St. Louis cannot be considered a purely black and white town. We're almost 10% of this other category. And so with that high of a percentage, our voices need to be heard too. And we have something we can contribute. And so I went online with those views, and all of a sudden I was hit with a total backlash from the people who I was most expecting to support my voice. And that's what really bothered me. I had people who I had marched alongside at these protests telling me that the Michael Brown kind of protests were all about anti-blackness, and that literally they told me including the voices of other minorities would muddy the waters, and that by placing another minority on the commission, that it would just confuse things and detract from the issues. And I was incredibly hurt by that, because while I realized that the events in Ferguson directly concern the Black Americans who are living here, to exclude the voices of such a valuable portion of the population, to me means that the conclusions reached by this committee can't entirely be valid. It's not that I'm looking for a committee in Ferguson to hear about Asian racism or about Bosnian racism in St. Louis. but to exclude from the commission even the ability of those subgroups and those populations to speak, to me, is going to be detrimental to the healing of St. Louis.
Do you know anybody from the Asian community or other not Black or white communities that applied to be on the commission?
I know I applied. I know I did apply. I also know that several people from the synagogue down the street from me applied. The committee also, from what we can tell, is an all-Christian group. And it ignores the Muslim and the Jewish and the Hindi and the Buddhist populations that are also such an integral part of the St. Louis community.